Hello, everyone. We are back, right? I'd like to welcome Tatagat Varma. He is the Strategy and Operations Director at Walmart Global Tech. We are really happy to count on him today. He will talk about PMOs and complexity management. And so he'll talk about some really important topics, for a PMO leader. And it's a privilege for us to have a chance to hear about, his experience. So Tatagat, thank you very much for accepting our invitation. It's a honor for us to count on you. And that's it. The show is yours.
Thank you,
Okay, so
Americo.
feel free to start.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate Americo. Thanks for inviting me over. And first of all, let me just do a quick check-in. I hope all of you are doing fine. This is like a very crazy time with COVID and all. So I hope you and your loved ones are all staying safe. Please take care of yourself. And I think we must exercise utmost caution and precaution to make sure that we are all doing fine. I also came to know that Gaurav is recovering post his COVID, so I wish him speedy recovery. And I want to thank Gaurang and Gaurav and Karthik also for helping me through this. And congratulations on starting the India chapter. My best wishes, and I'm happy to be a part of it and see how I can contribute to the success. With that, I want to have a short presentation here on this occasion. And I want to talk today on my favorite topic, which is on complexity management, which I believe is a very important topic in the current situation here. By way of introduction, as Americo said, I lead the strategy and operations at Walmart Global Tech in India. I'm based out of Bangalore. I'm also pursuing my doctoral studies at Indian School of Business, Hyderabad, in AI and other systems. So happy to chat with anyone who has interest in those areas. With that, let me get started on the topics. I hope I'm audible to everyone and the slides are visible as well, because I think I'll have to just yes, I can see some. Thanks, Karthik. So let me get started here with that. So if we look at the evolution of PMOs in the last, like from 200 years onwards, if we see, we can clearly see that the evolution of PMOs has gone through some major stages. It started probably during the British time when it was part of the British Empire, and they basically used it for various kind of surveys or national governance of agriculture industry and so on. And then in the little more recent context, last century, we started seeing more during the wars, because that was those huge efforts that had to be coordinated. And in the industry context, we really started seeing the whole idea in 1950s with the post-war scenario where a lot of industrialization started happening. And that is how typically our PMO, contemporary PMO, also looks like today. Even though our needs have kind of changed and it is a little more dynamic there. So let's just quickly see how does it really look like in terms of the various stages here. Now, if you look at the various stages, we obviously, when we are a small company, we start with a small project office. You have one or two projects, and then you go over a period of time. Like in stage 3, you might look at, in stage 2, you are looking at really building a repeatable capacity, a repeatable capability across the projects there. And then in a stage 3, you are looking at really establishing organization-wide infrastructure and capabilities to do that. And in stage 4, you are really connecting it to the business objectives. And stage 5 is when you are really beginning to start strategic business goals of the firm there. So that's a good way for us to look at how it is there. And even though Hill really talks about it in this paper and says that, hey, for most of the organization, it doesn't mean that the higher stages are better. It doesn't mean that everyone runs to the stage 5. In fact, he says most of the time stage 3 is good enough actually, because not every PMO might need to do. But I still see some challenges in this perspective, and I'll talk about that here. So now when we are looking at the problem solving, my favorite metaphor or my favorite mental model here is what we call as a design squiggle. And a design squiggle is a very nice way to think of how problem solving really goes through, what are the evolution of the stages of that. So as you can see on the left, we start really with the research and synthesis, and at that time there is like so much of noise and uncertainty and so on that we don't fully understand. So that's why you see a lot of mess over there. And then over a period of time we apply the methods and we are able to make some sense out of the noise. We are able to cull out the signal out of that. We are able to figure out some very clear pattern and insights out of the whole thing, and over a period of time it goes into a little more smoother shape there when we can really craft the solution properly because we have clarity and the focus there. Now keep that in the back of your mind as we go through the discussion, because and I do want you to keep thinking and challenging your own mental models, whether your approach is more suited towards what we see on the right side of it versus what we see on the middle side of it versus what we see on the left side of it, because that's a very important calibration that we all need to think of. So let's keep moving for now, and I'll keep referring to that. Now, the challenges that we see is that our extent approach, or what we follow currently, Jack Dougal's book has a very interesting perspective, and he talks about that, and he says that traditional approaches, our conventional approach, is really based on the mechanical view and deterministic methods. So for the last 200, 300 years, we have been talking about Descartes' whole reductionist approach. And we are really talking about that, hey, we can break down any problem by systematically decomposing the problem into smaller and smaller components till we reach the atomic components, or in physics we would call them as the first principles, and we cannot decompose them any further. And that's when we can kind of do, and it is all linear, so I can break down from top to bottom and I can add them up from bottom to top and I can still get back to the same thing. Well, guess what? The current set of problems that we deal with are not really like that. They don't seem to be able to hold on to those. They are very non-linear. They are changing all the time, and they are unpredictable project realities. So it's not very easy for us to think of the reductionist ways in which how we kind of solve the problems there. And what does it lead to? It actually leads to challenges there, because what we are seeing from the industry is that 25% of the PMOs are shut down after 1 year, and 50% after 2 years, and almost 75% PMOs are shut down after 3 years. And that is a big concern, because if the performance is not aligned to the business, then obviously we have a big challenge to solve there. And we need to bring the emphasis back on people's skills, on the leadership, on trust building, motivation. PMOs have to become a trusted partner in how we are solving the problem. So those are some of the directions that we are seeing from the research and from the industry point of view there, right? And then the challenge is, well, how do we really kind of do that? In my own understanding, in my own experience, the influence of complexity is a very understated and underemphasized, under-recognized thing. We don't always recognize that we are dealing with a different class of problems, but the class of solutions that we are applying do not always apply to them. And think of the design squiggle there, right? So what we are finding is that the complexity of interconnections in the PMO intellectual capital, and the whole thing is leading to significant dissatisfaction there. And the big challenge is that in our project management community at large, we have basically seen that we have been fixated with this whole idea for last 30, 40 years with the whole best practices. And we say, hey, what are the best practices? And what the current thought process is that when you are dealing with the complex systems, when you're dealing with dynamic systems, there is no concept of best practice. In fact, it is a field that does not have a best practice for a larger part of it, because the things are changing all the time there. So you are constantly evolving. Your best practice is the next practice, actually, that you have to keep thinking of what are you going to do next to kind of solve the problem. So that kind of a thing. And so let's just quickly talk about what is this complexity then, if we are saying that complexity is the key issue here. Now, I'll just introduce briefly this. We'll not have time to go through in detail, but I just want to introduce the whole idea of it, that when we are talking about problems, we we can start with simple problems, and simple problems are things that are very obvious. We can look at it and we can say, hey, this is how you would solve the problem. I mean, these are the elementary grade or the middle grade problems that we solve. For example, if five men can dig a hole 10 feet in 2 hours, how many 20 can do, kind of a thing, right? So you're really using simple algebra, simple arithmetic rules, and kind of solving it. Complicated could be that when things are little long-winded and you have multiple arguments, it could be a deductive logic where we need to understand that it is like all men are mortal and Aristotle is a man, hence Aristotle is mortal, right? So we are really using a lot of deductive logic to basically look at them because there is a long chain of reasoning. Well, things start getting a little interesting when we go to the complex zone, because complexity is something where we cannot establish the relationships very clearly. So we don't always know what will lead to which. So if then kind of relationship that we are very used to, they kind of start to break down at that point. So we do the same thing, but it still doesn't really give us the same result there. Like if you look at pandemic is a situation right now, in many cases, it's a complex situation. We don't quite know what is leading to the second wave in India, for example, or what leads to the herd immunity and so on. We have some models in the past, but we don't always quite know them. And on the far right, you have chaos. And chaos is a situation where there are no laws really. Things are totally chaotic. So if you think of, let's say, a 9/11 kind of an event is unfolding, which is totally chaotic event. We have no idea what is leading to what. How do I make sense of a given situation? Or if you say Chernobyl disaster, or if you think of the tsunami that came after Fukushima. I mean, these are the kind of things that are really chaotic ones where we cannot establish causal relationship between the events, and that becomes the whole thing there. So now, if I keep going on that one, and I'll just skim over just so that you give a context. So simple is what was easy to understand, which is not difficult. For example, I have Lego blocks. I just connect Lego blocks. I have the instructions. I can do that. A complicated might be things like, for example, your wristwatch, a mechanical wristwatch. Many of us have not seen a mechanical wristwatch in many years now, but a mechanical wristwatch has about 130 components. Now, if we are not trained in that, we cannot put it together because each part has a specific role in that and they connect to each other. But it is doable. With the training, you can follow certain principles and you can do it, even though I may not be able to do because I have never done that thing. But thinking about complex system is something which has so many interrelated parts. They are hard to separate, analyze, understand, or explain, and there is no way we can kind of put them together there because they are not reductionist, they are not deterministic systems. We invariably find them in the biological and the natural world, but increasingly we also find them in social systems. So for example, the economy of a country or the global economy is a complex system. The traffic patterns that you see are complex systems, and now we are seeing more and more as we get into the autonomous vehicles. For example, if you have a fleet of drones, you are going to run into complex systems because they will behave with each other. So these are becoming important issues that we need to consider as we in the coming time there. So a complex system, very simply put, is really a system in which a large network of components has no central control. Now, that's a very, very big difference from the traditional thinking of the control philosophy that we have had, that I can control the consequences. I can control the behavior of a system if I change the behavior, right? So in a classical project management, we look at the triangle, right? The iron triangle. We look at the scope. We look at the time and the cost part of it, and we can play with them, because if these were theoretically infinite, people would not need project managers, but they are finite, and hence we need to kind of put them in the right proportion. Or think of it like a chef. A chef has exactly all the spices and condiments available, but if you throw everything in that, you don't get a master chef recipe. The trick is that you have to really control the variables there. But now we are talking about a system where you cannot control it. Like, how do you control, who controls the economy or a stock market, for example? So there's no central control here. And there are simple rules of operation. Like if you think of the stock market, the rules are very simple. You have a selling price, you have a buying price. If the price match happens, the money changes hands and the share transfer happens there, right? But so if you have 1 million people trading their stocks, why does a stock market crash then? Nobody gets up in the morning and says, I'm going to crash the stock market today. And nobody's one individual action can be attributed to the stock market being crashing there, and yet it happens there, right? So how does it really happen? There are no complex rules around that. The simple rules that everybody plays is that if there is a price within my reach, I'm going to buy it, or if there is a price at which I have been selling it or within my margin, I'm going to sell it off. That's it. But then the behavior, so the micro rules are very clear, but the macro behavior, the collective behavior is what we call as complex there. And that is what really makes the whole thing so difficult to handle there. So for example, so now if we keep going, Jack in his book, he actually talks about how we bring the whole PMO concept into the whole idea. He actually gives a new perspective from VUCA to, he calls it as dance. And many of you might be familiar with the whole idea of VUCA, which is like the US military had initiated that doctrine of thinking like we are living in a volatile, uncertain, complex, and adaptive world, ambiguous, sorry. But he talked about dance, where he says it is dynamic and changing, it is ambiguous and uncertain, it is non-linear, complex and emergent and unpredictable. I think the key words to me as a complexity science student is non-linear, complex and emergent. And this is something which our traditional methods of command and control or deterministic methods cannot comprehend. So we need to think outside the box and go to some other subjects. And I'll introduce some of those ideas here in the next 5 minutes. So what Jack talks about in his book, he says that even though we have made a lot of progress in our thinking in the PMO methods, we have gone from simple to complicated, and we are talking about iterative methods, rolling wave planning, incremental methods, agile way of doing things. But at best, we have just come to really the whole complicated slash complex, little bit of complexity, but we don't fully understand how to lead in the complex and chaotic world. Edge of chaos is actually a special term and it requires more discussion. But the idea is that if it is total chaos, then nothing will survive there. Think of it like the world as a gooey mess before the Big Bang, right? That is where what is chaos really in some sense. Now chaos is a developed mathematical theory, the theory of chaos. So I'm not using the literal word of chaos where we are really talking about it where nothing is possible. It does follow certain laws, but it is a very different kind of science by itself. Complexity is something which has a certain argument to the whole variability and the vagaries of nature, and then in between you need to have a stage where the life survives, right? If the life has to happen there, we need to have that stage between chaos and complexity there. But irrespective of that, the key point that Jack talks about in his book is also that we don't have solutions really to deal with the complexity in this, and hence it is important to kind of keep understanding it. So what is this complexity really all about? I want to just share one of the frameworks that's very popular in the complexity science, which comes from Dave Snowden. He's a Welsh. It's a Welsh word actually that Dave has taken. He calls it as Canadian framework, and Canadian framework really talks about the problems in four different. It's a categorization and sense-making framework is how he describes it. So if you look at it, let me try to spend a few minutes here. There are some kind of problems. If you see the obvious, right, the far right quadrant, obvious problems are something which is like if you touch a hot object, your finger burns, and then it's very clear that your finger was burned because the heat of the vessel, and it's very clear that you sense it because your fingers are sensing it. You categorize it in your mind immediately that hey, it is because of the heat it has happened, and then you respond it, right? So you respond it. In our case, it's a very natural human body response. But in the case of an organization, you can imagine that if you are sending a very unclear message to an employee, then the employee will be confused there, right? It's very easy to establish the causal relationship between them. So it's very obvious to us, right? If we go a little up on the side on the complicated, think of it like the wristwatch scenario that I talked about. It has 130 parts. You know that there are relationship between them, but remember one thing, even if one part is missing, the watch shall not work. And that's a very key distinction between complicated and when we go to the complex part, because if one part is missing, you cannot have any other part really take over. It is not like a football team where if one player is red carded, the other players can still manage there. A wristwatch does not have that concept there. So we call it as a complicated. It is not easy to really do that, but if you analyze the problem enough, you can use the good practices to kind of understand that. But when you go to the complex on the left side, the whole conversation changes, because you are really talking about an area where you have to probe, you have to sense it, and then respond based on that and say, hey, does it really work that way? So if you think of what's happening in COVID situation, we didn't really know how to deal with the pandemic. We are trying something. For example, in India right now, we have tried with the partial lockdown. It didn't work. Now we are going with the full lockdown, like in Karnataka, where I live, for the next 2 weeks there. So we have to keep changing. It is the whole practice itself is very emergent, as we call it. It is not something where there is a good practice or a best practice and I can simply go and apply it. I need to think of it with a very open mind and say, I need to keep doing some small, what we call as safe to fail experiments. A safe to fail experiment, unlike a fail safe experiment, is that I'm basically trying out. It's a small piece of experiment. If I fail, it's not going to kill me. It's just going to advance my knowledge further. So I keep doing those safe to fail experiments, and I keep building by a series of safe to fail experiments my emergent practice there, right? So that's the complexity. And down below you come, you're talking about the whole chaotic part, which is like you have no idea what's really happening. You have 20 different things going on at the same time, whether it's a event like a 9/11 or whether it's an event like Chernobyl, where you have no idea there. So some of you might have watched the documentary on Netflix, for example, where the same thing, when they do it, actually reacts in a different way, and at that time they are not able to figure out why did the whole meltdown really happen there, right? The same thing should have stopped the meltdown, but then it just happened there. So it's a chaotic system at that point in time, and you can only act and first act like it is like a fire. Or let's say you cut your hand there and you have bleeding happening there. You're not going to go at that point in time and figure out well, what caused the bleeding, or how, what is the nature of it. You will do whatever it takes to stop the bleeding there first, right? That is the first most important thing there, because that is life critical at that point in time. And later on you will figure out that, oh, this is what really happened there, and you might classify them. So you have a chaotic system. You first try to bring the chaotic into a complex zone. You cannot bring out to an obvious immediately there, but you try to really move up there and kind of go to the complexity. And the whole idea there is that we build a body of knowledge by moving from chaotic to complex, complex to complicated, complicated to obvious, because you have to reverse the cycle there. Your body of knowledge can only be when it is between obvious and complicated. It is very difficult to comprehend that a complex body of knowledge can exist, but that's reality. That's how things are, and we have to really collate all that and kind of codify the idea there and do that thing. So those were some of the perspectives there. It is a good framework that can help you to categorize the problems. So you have a good way to categorize and say, okay, if it's an obvious problem, I'll apply these best practices. If it's a complicated, I know there are some good practices that are there which we can do. But the moment I'm going into a complex zone there, all of this break apart, and there's no way I can kind of go there. And it is also a great way to sense making there, which is becoming a very big organizational imperative. We have to, we are often finding ourselves PMO leads and directors more so often into situations which are multiple points there, right? If I'm working only in one area, maybe life is much easier because I can still contain it. You have HR issues, you have finance issues, you have organizational issues, you have legal issues, you have labor relations, you have like n number of things going on. And you need to make sense out of it and say, hey, how do I really prioritize my efforts? Where do I really start putting it? So you have to be able to think of it and say, which problem goes into which bucket, and how can I kind of start doing that thing there, right? So those are some of the ideas that I thought I'll just share here. And let me just recap here. I might have run out of time, and sorry about that, but let me just recap here quickly. The key thing to remember is that we are living in a world where the complexity is rising every day. I mean, that's the second law of thermodynamics. The complexity and the chaos and the disorder and the entropy shall keep rising there. That's just the way things are, right? We cannot use the traditional approach all the time. It has limitations. It is good when there is a more predictable world, but it is not really very helpful when we are dealing with a VUCA or a dance world where there is so much of uncertainty and dynamism in the problem space there. What we need, the need of the hour, is to really think of new solutions and say, how do we really bring the ideas from complex systems? And I'm happy to have discussions later on that. The whole idea being that complex systems isn't a very evolving subject. It's been around only for last 20, 30 years as a more systematic science. Even though the ideas have been around for about 200-300 years, we are building on them. But if you search for complex systems or complex adaptive systems, you will find tons of information on the internet. So I invite you to have a look at them as well. With that, I want to close my session here. And I'm sorry if I've taken more time, Americo, but I want to give it back to you. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Tatagat. It was really nice, very important knowledge for everyone that work on PMOs or project management anyway. So thank you very much. I have one question for you, just one, to close this session. I'd like to know, considering all the scenario that you presented, if you could say just one competence that you believe that a PMO leader should have to be able to deal, with all this scenario, what would you suggest? The most important competence in one word, just to make us think about that.
So I'll talk about one, and if that's okay with you, Americo, I will give one bonus also. But my favorite at this point in time, which I am seeing, is, especially if you are a senior PMO leader, is leading without authority. I think this is becoming a very important skill. Unfortunately, it is not a very new topic in the leadership circles. Most people are not aware of it, and those who are aware are very uncomfortable and underprepared to how do I deal with a situation where nobody reports into me. I cannot reward them. I cannot do anything. How do I really manage with them? So that is the thing. And the bonus I want to add to that, if that's okay with you, is the whole cultural agility part. I think we are dealing increasingly with a very, very culturally diverse world where people are dealing with multiple issues all the time. We have to have very nimble and culturally agile mindset to be able to assimilate it all together there. So the whole social empathy and emotional skills become very important in processing that. So those are the two things that I'll pick up, Americo.
Yeah, it's very good, very good. Thank you very much. It was really valuable for everyone. I'm sure about that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Excellent.